A lot of D&D spaces are in an uproar this week due to a report by Dicebreaker on an investor-focused seminar where Cynthia Williams, the CEO of Wizards of the Coast, mentioned that D&D has never been more popular and we have great fans and engagement, but the brand is really under-monetized. She also talked about how Wizards of the Coast's investment in D&D Beyond will allow the company to unlock the type of recurrent spending you see in digital games. The creators of 5th edition have been quite explicit for a while now about how they see D&D as more of a lifestyle brand than as a rule set, and this new plan is just a culmination of that. Their goal is for the RPG to become only 1/4 of the D&D brand, the other parts being movies, video games, and merch. These announcements have caused a lot of heated discussion, but really they're not that surprising. This sort of thing has been in the works for a long time, and it's exactly the sort of thing that a large toy company like Hasbro would naturally take when they find out that they have an unexpectedly popular IP. It's also been the general plan of action since the beginning of the hobby. Gary Gygax famously moved out to Hollywood during the heyday of advanced Dungeons & Dragons to try and get a movie and a TV show made, and AD&D itself was used as a vehicle to sell specially branded miniatures, dice, accessories, and so on. These efforts were only somewhat successful. Turns out it's actually quite difficult to make a lot of money at RPGs since game masters are the only ones buying anything. WotC's One D&D initiative is just the latest attempt to crack this problem, and who knows, maybe it'll be successful. What's really interesting to me, though, is the way that these sorts of controversies bring out different tribes of D&D players. There's tons of subcultures within D&D, but in my opinion, one of the most fundamental distinctions is between what I'm going to call folk D&D and official D&D. The people who participate in folk D&D see the game as essentially a kind of folk tradition or practice. When they think of playing D&D, to them it's more like painting or knitting. It's just an activity that you do on your own terms, not an engagement with a particular brand or a corporate product. The rules they use tend to be idiosyncratic to their particular group and evolve over time. Although they probably own some rule books, they're not super concerned with the official state of the rules since they see tweaking them as part of the game. To them, the creators of 5e are just another group of homebrewers, like anybody else. There might be some good stuff in there to steal, but the product isn't any more real or more authoritative than something that they made themselves. Gary Gygax, at least the Gary Gygax of 1975, would fall into this category when he said in Alarms and Excursions, "Dave and I disagree on how to handle any number of things, and both of our campaigns differ from the rules found in D&D. If the time ever comes when all aspects of fantasy are covered, and the vast majority of its players agree on how the game should be played, D&D will have become staid and boring indeed. Sorry, but I don't think that there is anything desirable in having various campaigns play similarly to one another. My answer is, and always has been, if you don't like the way I do it, change the bloody rules to suit yourself and your players. D&D enthusiasts are far too individualistic and imaginative a bunch to be in agreement, and I certainly refuse to play God for them. People engaged in folk D&D don't find WotC's monetization plans all that concerning one way or another, since what WotC does has literally no impact on them or their games. It warrants an eye roll at most. It's just business as usual for a big toy corporation. On the other hand, we have official D&D, which is a group with a very different perspective on the nature of the game. But before we get into that, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Into the AM, my favorite producer of fantasy and sci-fi t-shirts. They've been a long-time supporter of the channel and make some of the softest, most long-lasting shirts that I've ever worn, like this one, which I thought was a great metaphor for running D&D games. I get compliments on the shirts all the time and wear them nearly every day. They have a huge selection of shirts on their website and have an ongoing deal where you can get 3 t-shirts in a bundle for just $60. If you use my link in the description below, you can also get an additional 10% off on top of that. Go check them out, and thanks to Into the AM for supporting the channel. Now let's get back to the show. So let's look at this other camp that I'm calling official D&D. People in this camp see D&D as the brand currently owned by WotC. That's what the word means to them. The rules in the core rulebooks and errata are regarded as normative and an aid to unifying the D&D community. Gary Gygax, at least the Gary Gygax of 1982, would fall into this category when he said in Dragon magazine, "Since the game is the sole property of TSR and its designer, what is official and what is not has meaning if one plays the game. Serious players will only accept official material, for they play the game rather than playing at it, as do those who enjoy house rules poker or who push pawns around a chessboard. No power on earth can dictate that gamers not add spurious rules and material to either the D&D or AD&D game systems. But likewise, no claim to playing either game can then be made. Such games are not D&D or AD&D games. They are something else, classifiable only under the generic FRPG catch-all. Basically, feel free to house rule the game, but don't you dare call it D&D anymore. Your house rules have shifted it away from its approved form into something else. To people who play official D&D, WotC's plans are of huge importance and a cause for alarm, because D&D fundamentally is the book that WotC publishes. If WotC messes that up, then they've messed up D&D. Side note, the wildly different viewpoint that Gary expressed in 1982 was due to him needing to supplant D&D with a D&D in order to cut the original game's co-author, Dave Arneson, out of his royalties. Later in life, when Gary himself had been ousted from TSR, he reverted back to a more folk D&D stance, running a heavily modified version of original D&D at conventions. As far as I know, he didn't play the AD&D rules as written at all. I think it's important to clarify that these two factions, official D&D and folk D&D, aren't necessarily tied to a particular edition of the game. There are plenty of 5e groups who just play however they want and ignore the official material. And I've seen old school players who scour older editions of the game looking for the official way to play. Nor is the division really about whether or not you modify the game. It's more about whether you see the official rules as more real or authoritative than the stuff that you make up at home. One thing I've become fascinated by is how this official/folk dichotomy comes up over and over in fandoms, especially in tabletop gaming. In Warhammer 40k, the official-minded players are critiquing the army balance in each codex and following the official lore, while the folk players are 3D printing and kit bashing their figures and writing their own rule sets. In Magic the Gathering, official players are concerned with how WotC's mismanagement will affect the game's meta, while the folk players are creating their own formats, printing their own cards, and playing with beat-up 30-year-old card collections. In case it's not obvious yet, I definitely fall pretty far on the folk D&D end of the spectrum. WotC's business plans are somewhat interesting to me on an abstract level, but in the end, I don't care that much what they do. My games will look the same either way. My personal take is that it's probably not healthy to get too wrapped up with what an impersonal, for-profit corporation does. They're never going to make the best creative decisions, and you don't really have any say over what they do. It's best not to tie up your identity to a one-sided relationship like that. D&D and RPGs in general are wonderful because unlike video games, they are simple and analog, and they can continue on just fine without any corporate support. There's a real sense, I think, in which companies like WotC and Games Workshop act as a kind of parasite on their respective hobbies, siphoning money from players who think that they need them when that's increasingly no longer the case. In the early days of the hobby, it was a lot easier to argue that RPGs needed a strong central leadership. You needed a healthy corporation in order to advertise the game, pay for layout and design, print thousands of books, warehouse them, and ship them out to stores. Today, none of that is true. There are books and forums that help you design your games. There's layout software that's cheap and easy to use. Kickstarters and live streams can advertise your work to millions of people. Digital distribution is free, and print-on-demand services solve the whole printing, warehousing, and shipping conundrum in one fell swoop. 3D printing even allows you to make miniatures as detailed as Games Workshops for pennies each, at least once you buy a printer. The bottom line is, if all the big gaming companies vanished tomorrow, hobby gaming would do just fine. It would probably get a lot more interesting. Now, are companies like WotC going away soon? No. They'll be around for decades to come probably, milking their franchises as hard as possible until the current fad blows over and they go back to being curiosities. But as the different incarnations of official D&D rise and fall, I expect folk D&D will continue on under the surface, until at some point down the road it's all that's left. It's more resilient than the official take on gaming, more player-friendly, and in my experience of reviewing books from the old school Renaissance movement, it's more creative. Well, what's your take? Does official D&D serve an important role that I've missed? Have you had any remarkable experiences in the folk side of gaming? Let me know below. Remember that you can support the channel on Patreon if you want to help it grow, and that I have a free monthly newsletter that keeps you up to date on all sorts of folk gaming content from around the internet that you may have missed. Links for that are all down in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.